Good morning. If you're interested in following along, I'm on page 12 of your notebook of handouts. Might want to do that and take some notes in the margin, that kind of thing. Welcome, welcome, welcome. In Luke chapter 12 and verse 15, Jesus says, "A man's life does not consist of the abundance of the things that he possesses." That's Jesus' way of saying you love people and use things. Sadly, in our world today, we often do the opposite. People love things and use people. But I've often thought about, okay, now what if we turn this around? We're told in a negative that a man's life does not consist of the abundance of the things that he possesses, which is certainly a good reminder in our day about what really matters. But what if we turned it around and said, okay, a man's life consists of fill in the blank? How would you fill in that blank? A person's life consists of, I'd fill it in relationships. I mean, that's what really matters. Jesus was asked about the greatest commandment of the 613 thou shalts and thou shalt nots in the Torah. And that was a matter that the early rabbis debated frequently. What's the most important? And Jesus immediately pulled from Deuteronomy chapter 6, said you're supposed to love God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength. Then the second is likened unto it, to love your neighbor as yourself. And so the first thing we need to focus in on is our vertical relationships with God, and then our horizontal relationships follow. Of course, in a generic way, that's our neighbor, and our most important neighbor is our spouse, right, and our children, which is what leads us to this particular weekend as we talk about the things that matter most. Yes, marriages are made in heaven, but so are thunder and lightning storms. Right? We're going to talk today about how to manage and deal with some of those thunder and lightning storms, which comes in every healthy marriage. If you're ever going to have growth, movement, along with movement, you always have friction. And the more movement, the more growth, the more friction. And that's really the way it is in life. You're going to have a certain amount of friction or disagreements. And we need to come up with some well-kept skirmishes, some ways that we can determine how we can work through those differences in a way that is amicable and constructive and not destructive. In studying the marriage and family literature, when I used to teach marriage and family at Florida College, I was amazed to learn that the number one interpersonal skill necessary for long-term marital happiness and stability is the ability to resolve conflict. That's critical. I mean, some people think that if a couple really gets along well, then they won't have arguments, they won't have disagreements. That's really not what the research says. Some couples that are very happily married argue a lot, but they have a dialogue that is respectful, and they learn how to work through their differences, so when you get to the end, you feel like you came to a really good, mutually agreed upon decision. So another way to look at this is God's prescription for marital conflict. And it's interesting to me that most couples find their first couple of years are the most challenging of all their marriage. It's not true for everyone, but it's often true because what happens is when you first get married, it's like the merging of two great rivers. You know, if you've had a lot of snow up in the mountains and then the spring comes and the snow begins to melt and you have these tributaries and they often come running down these mountainous ravines and they meet in the middle, and when that happens you have the rapids. That's often what describes the first year. There is a clash of preferences and ideas that contend for power and habits that vie for position, and it's the merging of two different lives together as one as you try to share the same time, space, and resources. And couples need to be aware of how many challenges there are to just the initial adjustments, especially, and adjustments that occur throughout the rest of marriage. And so conflict is inevitable, so we have to agree on a way to settle our differences in an amicable and biblical manner. In fact, I believe that if handled properly, arguments can be windows to intimacy. They can be things that are not tragedies, but opportunities for greater understanding. Venting personal frustrations through lips that have learned how to do so can serve a wonderful purpose. But it takes skill and self-control to turn potentially destructive squabbles into, can I use the term, fair fights, which solve problems and yield positive results. So we're going to look today at 10 keys for loving relationships. Part 1 will be keys 1 through 5, and part 2 will be keys 6 through 10. And these are just absolutely essential principles. I think I mentioned last night that we don't talk about these things in school. They're not taught in school. Teach a lot of things in school I wish they'd just leave alone, let the parents handle. But how wonderful it would be if they would really teach our children how to peacefully resolve conflicts. And oftentimes in churches, we don't talk about this subject very much at all. And so it's not surprising that many, many couples struggle with this particular aspect of their relationship. And if you don't get a handle on it, it often is the reason why people just throw in the towel and ultimately get divorced. So many years ago, when I first came across some of this material and this literature, had 7 rules for fighting fair. And now we're up to 10 as I've grown and learned. And instead of calling it fighting fair, which some brethren didn't like that terminology too well, because obviously you're not literally fighting. It was a, kind of an accommodative term. So now I just call it 10 keys for loving close relationships, because that's exactly what these things are. Kind of think of them as rules of the ring. When you have areas about which you're going to differ, we need to figure out how to follow certain guidelines. And the first and foremost, most important one that must never be forgotten, is everything we do needs to be driven by love. This is the one principle from which all the others spring. This is sort of laying the foundation. Obviously, the Bible says, husbands, love your wives, even as Christ also loved the church and gave himself up for it. And Titus 2:4 says the older women are to teach the younger women how they might love their husbands and appropriately love their children. That means more than just having warm feelings for each other or affection. It means you learn how to act in their best interest, always seeking their good and never wanting to do anything to hurt them. It's not just an emotion. Love is basically a decision to behave in a certain way. In 1 Corinthians chapter 13, when Paul defined and described love in the love chapter, he said, love is patient, love is kind, love does not seek its own way, does not act unbecomingly. There are these principles that are verbs. Love is not defined as a feeling. It's not just a bunch of gushy sentimentality. It is a commitment to treat other people in loving ways. And we always need to remember that commitment, that decision we made to choose our spouse and to choose to love them to the best of our ability every day. That's especially important to remember when we're having conflict. Everything we do needs to be driven by love. our love should sustain our marriage, and that our marriage should sustain our love. And we need to maintain an atmosphere of we're on each other's side, and we're doing our best to act these things out in love, though there are going to be times where we differ, and there are going to be times where we frustrate each other and hurt one another and disappoint one another. And at times like that, we need to give each other a lot of grace. But we need to talk through things appropriately so they can hopefully get better over time. So everything you need to do first needs to be driven by love. So with that understood, let's go on to rule number 2. Do your thing to cool off. You don't want to ever be ashamed of anger. You haven't sinned if you've gotten angry. Jesus at different times was filled with righteous indignation, like when he went into the temple and drove out the money changers. Anger is natural. It has its place. It can motivate us to do things that need to be done. But sadly, anger can so easily get out of hand and cause us to do and say things that we will regret. Proverbs 29:22, an angry man stirs up strife, and a hot-tempered man abounds in transgression. You probably heard the saying that no one really wants your temper, so keep it to yourself. And that is good advice. One of the things that is the reason for, like Proverbs 16:32. Just a minute. An angry man stirs up strife, and a hot-tempered man abounds in transgression. And he who is slow to anger is better than the mighty, and he who rules his spirit than he who captures a city. So we need to understand that when we get angry, it's a form of intoxication. If you really find that your fuse is lit, it can cause you to say and do things that you normally wouldn't say, sort of similar to being intoxicated when you lose your inhibitions. So emotions can hijack the rational part of your brain, and adrenaline causes us to fly off the handle and can often cause us to lose our self-control. And so a really important principle of resolving conflict is to remember, if you argue when you're angry, you're apt to just make matters worse. We sometimes sing a song called Angry Words, right? Oh, let them never from the tongue unbridled slip. That is very good wisdom and advice. If we're driven by love, we'll do whatever it takes to cool off first. I'm serious about this. If your spouse has done something or your children have done something that really has upset you, it's best to take a deep breath. Thomas Jefferson is the one who first said, count to 10 before you say anything else. Sometimes you need to count to 1,000 and not just 10. I recommend that people say, let me just take a break for just a minute. Go out and engage in some physical activity. Maybe go for a walk or go for a run, or if you have weights downstairs, lift some weights. Notice I didn't say jump in a car and go for a drive. You don't want to be driving a car when you're really angry. My mom was notorious. We knew we were really in trouble when she would go and take a hot bath. She would literally do that to kind of let the steam off. I remember when there were 4 children in the Hunter family. I had 3 sisters as siblings, and sometimes we'd be mischievous or something, and we'd do something we weren't supposed to do, and my mom would catch us, and she'd say, I'm very upset with you all right now, and I want you all to stay right here in the den and think about what you've done, and I'm going to go and take a hot bath. And I'm going to think about what the punishment for each of you should be. And I remember that just the waiting for her to get done with that hot bath, it seemed like took forever, was part of the worst part of the punishment. And then she'd come back and she'd make sure she had all the facts, and then she'd dish out what privileges were going to be revoked or what we had to do or whatever. And I think that was really good parenting, because instead of just reacting out of anger, she would calmly try to think through what's best and what's fair and what's equitable. And then she'd just very calmly speak softly and carry a big stick. And I don't remember my mom ever raising her voice at us except to yell down the hall, "Come to dinner." And so that was a much preferred way of parenting than what a lot of people find themselves doing. Obviously, as Christians, you're upset with your spouse, take some time to get away and maybe pray about it. It calms the spirit and helps you to see the situation more clearly. The key is rule our passions rather than allowing our passions to rule us. Remember the old Karate Kid movie? One of the key elements, Gasogi, I think was his name or something. He said, never let passion override principle. And that's good counsel, not just in the martial arts, but in the art of dealing with your kids and actually dealing also with your spouse. No one likes living with a volcano, so we must cool off and get our anger under control. It may be, you may decide after prayerfully thinking about it or going for a walk that you've overreacted. And, I'm just going to let this slide. I'm going to just let the whole thing go. Proverbs 17, verse 9, he that covereth the transgression seeketh love, and is to his glory that can pass over a transgression. So a lot of times, because you have to choose your battles carefully, you just give each other grace. My spouse is not in the best mood today. I'm just going to give them grace and pray for them and not say anything at all. That's perfectly fine. However, if after you've thought about it and you realize this is, really something important, and perhaps it's something that is repetitive, I really need to get this to the next step. When you do that, you need to argue with the right person. Now, you may say, well, Brother Hunter, that sounds ridiculous. Who else am I supposed to argue with the person that has upset me or offended me? And yet, let's be honest. It is easy to take our frustrations out on innocent third parties. Solomon knew that. Proverbs 3, verse 30, do not accuse a man for no reason when he has done you no harm. And that's good counsel. I mean, let's be honest. Maybe a husband is really angry with his boss or a coworker, and his poor wife comes home and she can't do anything right because he's frustrated about someone else. Or similarly, a wife can be frustrated after dealing with the kids all day, or maybe she too comes home from work and she's had a tough day and she's ready for war because the traffic was so bad on the way home. I mean, there's just a whole lot of things that we can't deal with in the moment or don't deal with in the moment. And so we take it out on third parties. That, of course, is very common but grossly unfair. So Solomon says, do not accuse a man for no reason when he's done you no harm. True story. I know of a woman who worked in a factory, and at 5 o'clock some sort of bell rang indicating the day was over. And she stood up and she announced to her coworkers, I've had a terrible day. I can't wait to go home and spank my kids. And so obviously she was just looking for some excuse, right? To over-discipline for a small offense and vent her anger on those poor innocent children. Beating up on innocent third parties is what psychologists call dumping. Dumping is cruel. It allows you to escape the real person or issue and resolves nothing, and it only makes matters worse. So we need to have the courage and the insight to make sure we're bringing the complaint to the right person. The next thing to be aware of is make sure we're arguing about the right thing. Well, again, why would you argue about something that's not really the issue? Proverbs 15, verse 28 says, the heart of the righteous studies to answer, but the heart of the wicked just pours out evil things. It seems obvious, too, how many marriage conflicts are really about an unspoken agenda. And many arguments are fought about the wrong subjects. Maybe a husband criticizes his wife's housekeeping when the real complaint is the lack of intimacy in the relationship. Or maybe the wife criticizes her husband's tardiness when the real issue is she's feeling neglected. We have to be in touch with our feelings enough that we can ask, am I really angry because of this? Or is it something else? See, the heart of the righteous studies to answer. You know, Socrates said the first rule of life was know yourself. And that's a good principle. You know, get in touch with your own feelings. What am I reacting so angrily about? Why? Sometimes our arguments solve nothing because we're not really even talking about the right thing. A good indication of a hidden agenda is when our anger is out of proportion to the actual offense. Maybe the spouse is 10 minutes late and you make a federal case out of it, but that's really not the issue. There are other things other than the tardiness that are bothering you about him, but you won't bring it to the surface. The issue here is often just one of honesty with ourselves and honesty with others. Ephesians 4:25, therefore laying aside falsehood, speak truth, each one of you with his neighbor. So let's be upfront about our frustrations. Stop working with hidden agendas. Not only is it dishonest and unfair, but arguing about the wrong thing doesn't solve the problem. Jesus said, the truth will set you free. You want to have authentic relationships, which means you deal with the real issue, not some peripheral issue. Rule number 5, argue at the right time. Ecclesiastes 3 says, there's a time for every purpose under heaven. A time to keep silent, a time to speak, a time for war, and a time for peace. You know, sometimes choosing the right time is more important than even choosing the right words. We must both agree that the time is right. Go forth not hastily to strive, Solomon said, lest thou know not what to do with the evil that's brought about. I mean, you may be upset with your spouse, maybe right before he or she goes off to work, but probably there at the breakfast table when you have to leave in 10 minutes is not the time to drop a bombshell, and then you can't finish discussing it, and then you try to go off to work and you got this dark cloud hanging over your head, and you can't finish it until 8 or 9 hours later after you get home and you've been fighting traffic and you've been thinking about it all day long. I mean, have enough self-control to wait and talk about a serious issue at a time when you can calmly, hopefully, finish it before you both pillow your head at night. It's important to think about times not to argue, not to bring up some sensitive subject. Obviously, in front of company is not a very good thing to do. We were at a family reunion one time, and there were all these family members around, and there was somebody in our family who was having marital difficulties, and both the husband and wife were arguing and putting each other down in front of everybody else. Boy, was that awkward. And what that was an indication that they weren't doing their dirty laundry at home. My dad used to say, you do your laundry, your dirty laundry at home, not out in public. You know, there's certain things you need to talk about in private between the two of you, and you don't bring it out at a party. If that's happening, that's just an indication they're not taking care of things like they should at home. And I can remember that particular day, and I felt sorry for everyone. And the couple that was arguing in front of everyone else wasn't even aware that they were just really being rude and inappropriate in discussing those issues out in public. So make sure there's time to finish. Make sure it's done with some measure of privacy. And try to avoid arguing when either party is hungry or tired, because that obviously makes the person less likely to be responsive as well. You know, the marriage and family literature says that 80% of marital fights occur between 5 and 6 p.m. Now, why do you think that is? Because in most cases, one or both parties have just come home from work and they're tired and worn out, and they wind up venting on their family members. Instead of celebrating being together, you wind up dumping on each other. So unless the pipes are broken in the basement and everything is flooding and you've got to deal with it immediately because it just happens to be one of those things that can't be put off, try to decide that when you get home from work, that's when you find one another, you welcome each other, you give each other a kiss, you wait till after dinner to talk about things that are maybe a little sensitive or difficult. My wife and I had that rule for many, many years, and it was always nice to be able to come home from work. I taught at Florida College for many years, and my wife was a full-time homemaker, and I just always enjoyed coming home, greeting her, giving her a hug and a kiss, asking her how her day was. It's always a temptation to want to pick up the mail on the way in and kind of look through the mail first. But I found it was much better to set the mail aside and to prioritize her first. And unless it was something just really serious, we would, after we've had dinner and put the kids down and maybe we go for a little walk or something, that's when we talk about the day and bring up things that were kind of sensitive. It just worked out so much better for us. And you're not worrying about arguing in front of the children, and you're not really tired, and you're not hungry. It's just the path of wisdom to try to give each other that space and to set up some of those kind of positive habits. So a good rule of thumb is do not discuss problems until after dinner, and you have some measure, of course, of privacy. Okay. I guess this is the end of the first 5. We've done this pretty well, haven't we? Anybody have any questions before we take our break? Any thoughts about the first 5 rules? Yes, sir. You're Justin, right?
Yes.
Hey, Justin. Good to see you.
Me too. You mentioned in the context of arguing about the right thing, one of the points was we must give ourselves the right feelings. Do you have any good tips or things like that, how to look introspectively to think about why it is we want to argue about this thing?
Yeah, it's really helpful to keep a journal. It used to be very common for people to keep diaries. People don't do that much anymore. But sometimes just sit down there in a Word doc and just kind of journal your thoughts and your feelings and your ideas and kind of vent to yourself. And oftentimes, when you get done, you do have some clarity. And then, of course, you can have a quiet time where you spend some time in prayer so that you have a better sense of what's going on in your own head, and then you can communicate that to your spouse rather than being somewhat confused and disoriented yourself and taking that out on your spouse. So that would be one suggestion, but it's just in general better to, especially if you've got something somewhat negative to say, really make sure that this is necessary to say and that it might end to something productive versus just kind of dumping on your spouse. Yes, Kathy.
If I may, I'd like to add on to that tip.
Sure.
I'm a very fast typer, and so if I have something on my mind, I could quickly produce 3 or 4 page document, and my suggestion is to have your quiet time, reread it a few times, and delete it, and then start over with some, I think it's very therapeutic,
Yeah.
but it's probably, for me, more harm than help to share the document.
Yeah. Dwight Eisenhower, he had a very similar principle. He would vent his feelings and all that, and usually he'd wait till the next day, and after that he'd think, ooh, that's way too harsh. And he'd either tone it way down or just delete it altogether.
Yeah.
So, we're going to talk later when we talk about successful quarreling about how important it is, if you're going to be successful in discussing things that need to be discussed, that you really a lot of times a good successful marriage is 3 things every day that goes unsaid. Only bring to the surface things that really need to be brought to the surface in order to kind of hopefully have long-term better understanding, rather than just sort of nitpicking all the time about every little irritant. Yes, Jesse, hi.
In talking about taking the time to cool off, do you, in your studies, has there been like a recommended time frame? What's too short, what's too long? I find that I want to discuss things quicker. He needs more time to cool off. So I'm like, all right, it's been 30 minutes. Now let's go. Like, is there a recommended, don't wait longer than a day, don't wait longer than a week, don't wait longer than
Well, the Bible specifically gives us some counsel about that, doesn't it? What does Ephesians 4:26 say? Yeah, it says, don't basically go to bed angry. Don't let the sun go down upon your wrath. So that tells me that, you don't want to put it off, more than a day.
Yeah.
And on the other hand, if you're one who wants some closure and wants to, talk about this and get it over with, be really cautious about trying to kind of chase the other person around the house. We're going to deal with this now. That usually just chases the person away. Men especially, when they get home from work, typically need to have a little time in their cave. They need to have a little time of space. And so give them that space and say, okay, how about in an hour? We'll meet. Gail and I used to have appointments, 9 p.m. after dinner, after the kids are down. Let's spend some time together. Let's talk. And that worked well for us. The key is you don't want to walk away because you're upset without communicating what's going on in your head. Because otherwise it looks like you're just avoiding it. Say, I love you, I know we need to resolve this. I will be back. Give me an hour, give me 30 minutes, and then we'll come back and we'll deal with it. And then if you're the one who kind of wants the closure, okay, I can wait for 30 minutes, I can wait for an hour. And then after some time has passed, then you can sit and talk about it. That's what I would recommend. But a person feels abandoned if the person just walks away, especially if they walk away and they don't want to discuss it. They don't want to deal with it at all. And that's very, very destructive, because one of the primary precursors of divorce is an avoidance of conflict, just breaking down and not communicating at all. That's worse than kind of having a marriage where there's a lot of disagreements, but as long as it's productive discussion, it's okay. The worst thing is just to shut down and stop communicating. So very good question. Thank you, Jason. Anybody else? By the way, when we were growing up, I had these, remember we used to have 7, we had these 7 rules up on a refrigerator. And it was a reminder to Gail and me, and as our kids grew up, we would teach our kids how to argue. We would have, sibling rivalry, typically, all the time. And we'd say, okay, no, don't call each other names. That's not, remember, you're violating the, we teach each other how to resolve conflict in the family. Boy, what a difference that's made. And both of my girls being very happily married now, because we gave them coping skills and we taught them how to resolve conflict in the home. Because you tend to resolve conflict the way you saw your parents resolve conflict, for better or for worse. And the best things in life are sometimes caught rather than taught. But in this case, I think you ought to model it before them, and you ought to consciously teach them these rules and principles as well. Okay, anybody else? Okay, let's take about a 5-minute break and then we'll come back for part 2. Thank you.